A major element of modern anime in this ongoing era of globalization is anime which borrows elements from world culture and history, no longer being exclusively relevant to Japan or its culture. While I've seen some anime that have borrowed, for better or for worse, elements of Chinese or Middle Eastern culture, amongst others, both ancient and modern, anime that borrow the thematic or cultural elements from the West stand out immensely, and as of now are a mainstay of the medium across most genres. Some people view this as a more open-minded, globalized Japan. Others view it as straight-up stereotyping of the West, and some even view it with a political lens, with the effects of westernization in mind. Now, which one of those you believe is true depends on your social and political outlook on life. If you're a person that consumes mostly anime as entertainment like me, cultural exchange in animation can seem like a rather one-sided affair, but most of the same arguments can be levied onto North American animation. US animation has also done its fair share of borrowing from elements of East Asian culture. Again, how you feel about the portrayal of those elements will depend on your social and political views. It's hard to pin down decisively whether these things are an homage to Eastern culture and cinema or an appropriation of it. That all depends on the specific works in question. But starting with animation on the Japanese side, the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s have provided us with numerous anime across several genres that take conventions that either gained popularity or originated in the West. One of our major fascinations here in the West is with the genre of fantasy, particularly fantasy with a medieval aesthetic, the kind with supernatural powers, dragons, knights, princesses, witches, goblins, orcs, etc. Things like Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, and multiple iterations of the story of King Arthur embody our fascination with this kind of media. And video games like The Elder Scrolls, RuneScape, World of Warcraft, and games based on the Lord of the Rings like Shadow of Mordor also continue the Western fantasy trend. No matter where in the Western world you live, this genre is inescapable, and is a defining aspect of our culture and our cinema and entertainment. However, in the last 25 or so years, Japan has also seemed to catch the Western fantasy fever, and has produced several works of Western-inspired fiction in manga and anime form, such as Berserk, Fairy Tail, Seven Deadly Sins, ReZero, Tales of Zestiria, and many others, not to mention games such as Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. Another staple of Western, particularly American cinema, is the mobster genre, which swept the US and Canada from the 70s to the 90s, with classics such as The Godfather, Casino, The Untouchables, and Goodfellas, to name only a few. And these films are based on a period of American history from approximately the 1910s to the 1950s or 60s, where organized crime ran rampant across the United States, with many gruesome killings being committed and many infamous legends being born, many of which were adopted into Hollywood films. The anime industry also carries on this organized crime niche, with shows like Bakano, 91 Days, Gangsta, Black Lagoon, and even anime that don't share the grittiness of those aforementioned series incorporate Western organized crime, such as Hitman Reborn, including Italian crime families into their narrative. And to get even more American than that, the recent big hitters, One Punch Man and My Hero Academia, employ conventions and aesthetic elements reminiscent of American superhero comics and the Marvel and DC cinematic universes. Other anime and/or manga that I know of that are inspired by elements of Western culture are Little Witch Academia, which takes the well-known stereotype of witches who wear pointy hats, dark clothing, ride brooms, and wave wands of magic and runs with it spectacularly to much critical acclaim, as well as Black Butler, which takes place during the Victorian era of England, which many people are fascinated by, and author Yana Taboso includes aspects that are most memorable about the era, such as Jack the Ripper's murders and the growing rivalry between England and Germany. And while there are questions as to its success in Japan, Trigun is inspired by old westerns, like those that were made popular by Clint Eastwood. Now, American animation in a very similar fashion borrows from Eastern culture, cinema, and anime. Now, whether you like it or not, most know that the Western world has a fascination with East Asian martial arts. Kung Fu, Karate, Taekwondo, and like I've said a few times already, whether you find these things endearing or offensive depends on your outlook. But I don't want to delve too much into controversial political territory. Because I want to keep this video based mostly on animation, I'll exclude live-action martial arts shows and movies. So the most prevalent animated example I can think of that focuses heavily on martial arts is the Avatar animated series, The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra. While the aesthetic of both series, more so in The Last Airbender though, is heavily inspired by traditional East Asian designs of architecture and clothing. There's also other animations like Kung Fu Panda, which has a major emphasis on East Asian style martial arts, as well as an East Asian aesthetic, and even older cartoons like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were very martial arts focused. And there's also American Dragon and Jackie Chan's Adventures. Samurai Jack is the American take on Japan's samurai cinema phenomenon, which was and still is a mainstay of Japanese entertainment in live action, anime, and manga. And Samurai Jack is doing pretty well for itself, being a hit during its run from 2001 to 2004, and has returned recently to much hype. And back on the Japanese side, Samurai Champloo and Afro Samurai are samurai anime with a huge American hip-hop influence, essentially blending two very distinct aspects of world history and culture into one. The mech genre is also a major part of the anime scene, especially with the reinvention of the genre with Yoshiyuki Tomino's Gundam in 1979, which made mech a major force in Japanese cinema ever since. This even inspired the creation of Transformers, and there were even collaborations between animators on both sides of the divide during the conception of the Transformers brand, which itself has become a dominant force in not only American but international entertainment, with the animations branching out into world-renowned films by Michael Bay. Aside from Transformers, there's Voltron, which was a Japanese-American production, which was relatively successful in the 1980s, and even has a recent reboot which I've seen a bit of, and I can say that it looks great visually. There's also Megas XLR, which ran in the mid-2000s and was also successful in its initial run, but unfortunately was met with cancellation due to low ratings later on. Not only do the West and East Asia share aesthetic elements in animation, from what I've observed they share a few philosophical aspects as well. Psycho Pass is a major dystopian anime that imagines an alternate Japan which is governed by an all-knowing and all-seeing computer system that can read a person's mental state in order to maintain order in society. However, an integral part of the narrative of Psycho Pass is in the references and quotes from several Western philosophers and authors, who wrote and expressed opinions relevant to the themes of the show. Avatar has several philosophical elements that stems from traditional Eastern modes of thinking, in which the characters use in order to develop. And there's also a major spiritual aspect to the show, which seems inspired by Buddhism. Again, there's probably more examples than just these two, but these are just the ones that I can name off the top of my head. Another thing that popped into my head while thinking of this subject is something that might not be entirely accurate, but I couldn't help but see things this way. Fullmetal Alchemist, which was created and animated in Japan, has a fictional world very similar to Western Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The way in which the nations and people interact with each other seems to mirror how Western Europe descended into chaos in the 1910s and 1930s and 40s respectively. Again, going back to Avatar, an animation made in the United States, if you look at it a specific way, the world of Avatar and how its history played out before and after the events of The Last Airbender are eerily similar to how China and Japan went to war in the late 19th and early to mid 20th century. And to an extent it even mirrors the aftermath of those conflicts. In a general sense, the show seems to mirror the progress of East Asian history in that time frame. I don't want to go into details because again I want to avoid controversial territory. Finally, animations from both sides also borrow presentation and storytelling elements from the other. Cowboy Bebop is very Western inspired in the way it presents itself and the way things play out. Baccano's style is very similar to that of Pulp Fiction. 91 Days progresses and presents itself not as a traditional anime, but rather in a similar way that mafia movies do, thus avoiding a lot of conventional anime tropes. Black Lagoon is similar to a no-holds-barred, over-the-top and high-octane action movie that you would expect from a Vin Diesel, Steven Seagal, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, or Jason Statham movie. American animation borrows a lot of conventions and aesthetic choices from Japanese anime. RWBY, the mid-2000s Teen Titans series, Avatar, and the Boondocks all employ an art style that looks very much like your traditional modern anime. The latter three also use quite a few tropes of the anime medium in the way they tell their stories, the action sequences, as well as in the way they approach comedy. Disney even took inspiration from Hayao Miyazaki's hit anime film in their creations of animated movies such as The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, How to Train Your Dragon, and Up. And a shout out to Totally Spies, because that's a French and Canadian production inspired by anime, and I just had to shoehorn that in there because I'm an asshole and I have to feel like my country's involved. Anyway, so I hope you all found this video interesting. I honestly think the cultural exchange in animation from both the US and Japan is fascinating. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm thankful for the continued support. Take care.